let's see if I can wrap up Plato's Symposium, still using the Hackett edition and the complete works of Plato here. So Alcibiades has just finished his speech, and the theme of the speech, reading it as literature, not as what Alcibiades said. You know what? Let's start with that. The theme of the speech, as Alcibiades says it, is that Socrates is wonderful and also incredibly annoying and incomprehensible and also somewhat rude. And why was that? It's because Socrates presents himself as a lover of young men, and then instead of fulfilling the expectation of this role, including the sexual encounters with said young men, he treats these men he's supposedly the lover of the same way he treats anyone else he's having a conversation with, asking them questions about their views on life, the universe, and everything, using the nice phrase from Douglas Adams, and urging them to care about virtue and the state of their own souls more than about money, power, fame, physical pleasures. Alcibiades finds this upsetting. He seems to have been upset that Socrates spurned his beauty and was not interested in a sexual relationship with him. Meanwhile, Alcibiades totally failed to respond to Socrates' good advice, which was, again, to care about virtue more than anything else, and not sell his soul for the applause of other people. And now I'm thinking, possibly, the following is the case. Any number of people have read this and said, hey, look how frank they are about homosexuality. Look how super gay so much of this story and so many of these characters are. Therefore, Plato's supportive of homosexuality. I think Martha Nussbaum thinks something along those lines, but don't quote me on that. I know I've heard it from, I've heard something like that before from one scholar. Let's see. Even though some people say that, this story looks to me like maybe a super duper scathing critique of maybe not homosexuality as such, but of homosexuality customs as they were practiced in Athens at the time, where the customs described by Pausanias that he thought were so great, where the older man takes on the younger man as a mentor-mentee relationship, and also has some sexual privileges with that young man. And this seemed to corrupt things. Socrates was not interested in that. He was only interested in training Alcibiades' soul, training his character, and Alcibiades couldn't comprehend this. Well, Alcibiades first didn't have the strength of will to reform his character in response to Socrates' arguments and good advice that he understood were correct. But also, Alcibiades thought that, some sort of magic would happen and he would have the right sort of relationship if Socrates became his lover and his special mentor, meaning he'd have some special counsel for him that he didn't give to everyone else, but also that it would come with sexual privileges, and then he spurns Alcibiades sexually, and Alcibiades is left just confused and angry. This looks to me like probably a thoroughly scathing critique of Athenian homosexuality customs. All right. What else is going on here? What did I begin this series saying? I began this series saying that we'll see in Alcibiades the problem of a person who's in love with Socrates rather than what Socrates is in love with. I think that's still a very appropriate commentary on this story. Alcibiades is a character who began to pursue Socrates instead of joining Socrates in a mutual pursuit of wisdom. That's another way of understanding what went wrong. And I think it's correct. I think both ways I've just described are correct. Anyway, with that commentary, let's wrap up the story. Alcibiades' frankness provoked a lot of laughter, especially since it was obvious that he was still in love with Socrates. And I'll just skip some of the banter and how Alcibiades is... Well, there may be nuance I'm not understanding, but it looks to me like it's a fairly simple case of Alcibiades is being mocked somewhat by Socrates and Agathon, and maybe there's nuance. Maybe Alcibiades is laughing along with them. I'm not entirely sure. And while this banter and this apparent mockery is wrapping up, there's talk of Socrates giving a speech in praise of whoever's in his right, changing the custom. Don't praise love. But Socrates was praised by Alcibiades. Now Socrates praises the next person, but never mind that. All of a sudden, etc., a large drunken group, finding the gates open because someone was just leaving, walked into the room and joined the party. There was noise everywhere, and everyone was made to start drinking again in no particular order. So now total chaos and more alcohol, more people, more alcohol, more disorder. And at this point, Aristodemus is our source of the story. Aristodemus said Eryximachus, the doctor who was saying, let's not drink too much, Phaedrus and some others among the original guests made their excuses and left. But Aristodemus fell asleep and slept for a long time. He woke up just as dawn was about to break. Roosters were crowing, and he finds Agathon, Aristophanes, and Socrates still awake. Socrates was talking to them. Aristodemus couldn't remember exactly what they were saying. He'd missed the first part of their discussion, and he was half asleep anyway. But the main point was that Socrates was trying to prove to them that authors should be able to write both comedy and tragedy. The skillful tragic dramatist should also be a comic poet. He was about to clinch his argument, though. To tell the truth, sleepy as they were hardly able to follow his reasoning. In fact, Aristophanes fell asleep in the middle of the discussion, and very soon thereafter his day was breaking. Agathon also drifted off, but after getting them off to sleep, Socrates got up and left, and Aristodemus followed him as always. He said that Socrates went directly to the Lyceum, washed up, spent the rest of the day just as he always did, and only then, as evening was falling, went home to rest. This extraordinary guy who's apparently not affected by alcohol and can do remarkably well without sleep as well as without shoes, even in the winter. But we are not told what sort of argument he was giving. We're only told its conclusion. The conclusion, we don't know the premises. The conclusion was authors should be able to write both comedy and tragedy, and the skilled author of tragic dramas should also be a comic poet. And that, I think, is what the Symposium is. It is the tragedy of Alcibiades, for reasons I've described. And it is also super hilarious with all the things that make us laugh as we go through Plato's Symposium. Above all, the ridiculous behavior of Alcibiades, but not exclusively that by any means. And what is the tragedy of Alcibiades? Well, maybe in part that he was corrupted by the customs that Pausanias thought so highly of, even though there is definitely still something right about them with that emphasis on virtue. But it may be that the tragedy of Alcibiades is just as usefully understood as the tragedy of your life if you do not take the advice of Socrates, which Plato is also giving you, and which I now repeat and now quote scripture on it instead of Plato. This is the NIV 1984 translation, I believe, of Proverbs chapter 4. I don't speak Hebrew. It looks differently in different translations, but I do like this translation, and whether it's the best translation, I can't tell you, but I'm quite sure that what it says is true. Wisdom is supreme. Therefore, get wisdom.